there was a statement that we think we can push evolution faster and in the direction we want it to go. The Bible will be changed. It will be rewritten to fit the new religion. Gradually, key words will be replaced with new words having various shades of meaning. Then the meaning attached to the new word can be close to the old word, and as time goes on, other shades of meaning of that word can be emphasized, and then gradually that word replaced with another word. The variability in meaning attached to any word can be used as a tool to change the entire meaning of Scripture and therefore make it acceptable to this new religion. In addition to changing the Bible, we said that classics in literature would be changed. I seem to recall Mark Twain's writings was given as one example, but he said the casual reader reading a revised version of a classic would never even suspect there was any change, and somebody would have to go through word by word to even recognize that any change was made in these classics. The changes would be so subtle, but the changes would be such as to promote the acceptability of the new system.
Hey, Inspire Tribe, my fellow freedom lovers. It's John Nolan here. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is Monday, December 30th, 2024. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're whole, we're free. That's the mantra. Thank you for joining us on X, Rumble, and YouTube in the live chat. Thank you for being with us. The last 2 days of this year, it's crazy. Half of the decade is over. And boy, has it been a crazy 5 years. We expect for this second half of the decade to not be any less intense. If anything, the intensity is going to grow. And I think we're going to see by the end of this decade where we stand. And, you know, largely it's up to us, which leads us right into today's show. It's the second part of the series of shocking predictions made in 1969. And when I say predictions, it's really what it was. It's really predicting the future. Now, for those of you who weren't here a few days ago when we had the first part, I encourage you to click on a link in the video description and you can watch the entire first part. But a quick recap. In 1969, there was a conference for pediatricians in Pittsburgh. And during one of the lectures, a famous pediatrician, at that time, pretty well-known pediatrician, Dr. Richard Day, gave a lecture to a room of pediatricians, and they had no idea what they were in for. But basically, he asked everybody to not take notes. Tape recorders weren't really a popular thing to carry around at that time anyways. And he laid out for them what the future was going to look like and how the new system was going to be brought in, and gave them a real breakdown of how society would be transformed and in turn the world. A guy named Dr. Dunegan made notes in a napkin and later recorded 3 tapes. And this is what we have today, sort of evidence. We can now look at the past 50 plus years and see how this is exactly played out. It's quite shocking in detail for to look at this and realize just how planned out this all was. Today, we're going to do part 2. At the end of the show, I'm going to offer a perspective that I think not a lot of people are considering, but that I think might be very, very valuable. So let's look at what Dr. Day said on that infamous March day, moving on from this last show. So he talked about changing the Bible through revisions of key words. To lead people into the new one world religion, he said, the Bible will be changed. It will be rewritten to fit the new religion. Gradually, key words will be replaced with the new words having various shades of meaning. Then the meaning attached to the new word can be close to the old word, and as time goes on, other shades of meaning of that word can be emphasized. And then gradually, that would replace that word replaced with another word. And of course, this isn't just sort of restricted to scripture. We've seen, especially over the last 10 years, the change in meaning of words, how they're being turned upside down over and over again. This has happened for a very long time, but at an accelerated pace in the last 5 to 10 years, where language has become so unrecognizable to a more technologically disconnected, maybe older generation that isn't sort of, in the zeitgeist, that it is almost impossible to follow a conversation. That's how insane this has become. And the variability in meaning attached to any word can be used as a tool to change the entire meaning of scripture and therefore make it acceptable to this new religion. Most people won't know the difference, and this was another one of the times where he said, the few who do notice the difference won't be enough to matter. Of course, people have noticed, right? And people have also said that sort of a Mandela effect plays a role in this. As you might remember, most people remember certain passages of scripture as to being different. The wolf and the lamb versus the lion and the lamb, for example. It's a classic example of millions and millions and millions of people having different memories of scripture. So all of this sort of blends together, and we can talk more about in the implementation of this plan, how this Mandela effect might be just a strategy to this plan. Then followed one of the most surprising statements of the whole presentation. He said, some of you probably think the churches won't stand for this. And he went on to say the churches will help us. There was no elaboration on this. It was unclear just what he had in mind when he said the churches will help us. In retrospect, I think some of us now can understand what he might have meant at that time. Now, mind you, Dr. Dunegan, when he makes those commentary about the day in 1969, it is 1989, 1990 when he's recording those tapes and is just adding his own commentary. But look at the last years, the revival of the church movement, the Christian movement here, and how closely it aligns with the technocratic new system, with AI, with the leaders of this new system. And it is probably to a large degree unknowingly helping this system. Some people, of course, are in the know, but most people are not. They're thinking they're sort of honoring their traditions when really they're pushing into the direction of this one world Luciferian religion that these people want to bring about. In addition to changing the Bible, he said that the classics in literature would be changed. I seem to recall Mark Twain's writings was given as one example. The casual reader reading a revised version of a classic would never even suspect that there was any change. And somebody would have to go through word by word to even recognize that any change was made in these classics. The change would be so subtle, but the changes would be such as to promote the acceptability of the new system. In addition to revising the classics, some books would just disappear from the libraries altogether. And further down the line, not everybody will be allowed to own books, and some books nobody will be allowed to own. Now, how is this happening today? Well, first off, reading has become a very rare thing. Most people don't read anymore. Attention spans are very short. The ability to comprehend the written word has become very tiny in most people. And so you kind of sort of don't have that problem. But for the reading population, you all know how books are being kept from people by them not being distributed through certain big chains. And even if they are, they're sort of being hidden. There's all these ways to do these things, and they have been doing them. You could arguably say that if you walk into a big chain store like Barnes and Noble, it's mostly worthless crap, and the good stuff won't ever even show up in there. The encouragement of drug abuse to create a jungle atmosphere. We're really going. And the words that we need to use when we think about what was said on that March day, you have to think of this as absolutely mathematical social engineering. This is what's been going on, not just since 1969, but way before that. At the time when Dr. Richard Day gave that lecture, they were so confident that their plans were already fully in motion, and that opposition was not even existing at that time, or very, very small, that they could sort of publicly announce it. Drug use would be increased. Alcohol use would be increased. Law enforcement efforts against drugs would be increased. On first hearing that sounded like a contradiction. Why increase drug abuse and simultaneously increase law enforcement against drug abuse? But the idea is that in part, the increased availability of drugs would provide a sort of law of the jungle whereby the weak and the unfit would be selected out. There was a statement made at the time: before the earth was overpopulated, there was a law of the jungle where only the fittest survived. You had to be able to protect yourself against the elements and wild animals and disease. And if you were fit, you survived. But now we've become so civilized, we're over civilized, and the unfit are enabled to survive only at the expense of those who are more fit. And the abuse of drug then would restore, in a certain sense, the law of the jungle and selection of the fittest for survival. News about drug abuse and law enforcement efforts would tend to keep drugs in the public consciousness, and would also tend to reduce this unwarranted American complacency that the world is a safe place and a nice place. Excuse me. Now, this is, again, think about this being 1969. And the streets are not yet flooded with heroin and cocaine and LSD and later fentanyl and ecstasy and everything in between, right? It's not that time yet. There are drugs, but not even remotely to the extent that we've seen them in later decades. The 70s really pushed hard. The 80s pushed hard. So you would have to imagine the kind of influence and power that the people or the entities orchestrating this already had at the time and always had, right? So this is some minutia style planning that they carried out, and they carried it out in full, right? I mean, we've seen this. You can't go to a big city today, and even in even smaller places, rural places, without noticing just the zombification and of drugged out people. The same thing would happen with alcohol. Alcohol abuse would be both promoted and demoted at the same time. The vulnerable and the weak would respond to the promotions and therefore use and abuse more alcohol. Drunk driving would become more of a problem, and stricter rules about driving under the influence would be established so that more and more people would lose their privilege to drive. All of this, of course, has happened exactly as described here. No more security, or a sense of security, if you will. Buildings would be allowed to stand empty and deteriorate, and streets would be allowed to deteriorate in certain localities. The purpose of this was to provide the jungle, the depressed atmosphere for the unfit. Other areas there would be well maintained. Not every part of the city would be slums. Somewhere in this same connection, he mentioned that buildings and bridges would be made so that they would collapse after a while. There would be more accidents involving airplanes and railroads and automobiles. Of course, once again, you have to look at this from a broader context. And I would encourage, for those of you who were around in 1969, to think about the sense of security. Maybe certain areas, people felt less secure because the Cold War was on, because this, whether that's the Cuban Missile Crisis or, just the looming threat of the Soviet Union, what was happening. But that was still, to a large degree, an external threat that wasn't really visible. You were told about it. The news were telling you about it. But this is more the internal everywhere threat to bring down the feeling of security. Think about gradually how that happened, how you were less and less willing to go to certain places in town, in cities. You were staying away from things. Now, a lot of people, of course, are staying away from planes and airports. In recent years, that has been ramped up. Since 9/11, other things, people are not traveling to certain places. So all of this has put the world into a constant state of alert, into a constant state of alarm, into a constant state of worry, which was exactly as intended. There would be the created slums and other areas well maintained. Those people able to leave the slums for better areas then would learn to better appreciate the importance of human accomplishment. This meant that if they left the jungle and came to civilization, so to speak, they could be proud of their own accomplishments, that they made it. There was no related sympathy for those who were left behind in the jungle of drugs and deteriorating neighborhoods. Then a statement that was kind of surprising. We think we can effectively limit crime to the slum areas so it won't be spread heavily into better areas. Now listen to this. This is going to reflect our reality perfectly. He went on to say that increased security would be needed in the better areas. That would mean more police, better coordinated police efforts. I can tell you that it used to be only on sort of the holidays and on big business days, but now it's almost all the time that at bigger malls you have this police tower that has all the technology in it that you could possibly imagine, which means that everything going in and out of the mall, facial recognition, all of that is happening at a very high level. You can't go to certain places. If you go to Miami Beach, you see it's all over the place. And so this has really happened everywhere. There would be a whole new industry of residential security systems to develop with alarms and locks and alarms going into the police department so that people could protect their wealth and their well-being. A sort of repeated thing throughout this presentation was the recognized evil and then the self-forgiveness thing. Well, see, we've given you a way out. But think about this notion in 1969 that all these security systems, alarms going into the police, and this being a whole industry. Think of the Ring doorbell cameras. Think of all people having camera systems and apps and all that, what's happening today. Doesn't that perfectly reflect, and was probably unimaginable in the 60s, to ever exist at the degree that it is now? Here, I mean, it is really a big one that most people sort of know, but again, think about the foresight and planning and how it fits our life perfectly now. The curtailment of American industrial preeminence, which of course also extends to Europe, right? Very similarly, American industry came under discussion. It was the first that I'd heard the term global interdependence or that notion, global interdependence. The stated plan was that different parts of the world would be assigned different roles of industry and commerce in a unified global system. The continued preeminence of the United States and the relative independence and self-sufficiency of the United States would have to be changed. Now, this is again for those of you, you think about, sort of this huge shift. There was a shift throughout, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, but then in the 90s, I think the big shift in public perception was when Bill Clinton became president, and he sort of made it clear it's not coming back, right? The industry is not coming back. The coal industry is not coming back. All of these things, they're gone. Get used to the new normal. But the sort of unimaginable destruction of American industry. But why, right? Why did they do it? And why did they plan it that way? We're once again, what we have to see here, what is so important about this, this plan is to notice how high or who would you have to be to make that possible? How powerful in the world system would you have to be to make that possible? And to this day, people absolutely underestimate the interconnectedness of this spider, right? Of this cult, of this group of entities that are the owners of these systems that we live in. This is one of the several times that he said, in order to create a new structure, you first have to tear down the old. And American industry was one example of that. Our system would have to be curtailed in order to give other countries a chance to build their own industries, because otherwise they would not be able to compete against the United States. So you see, the thinking is not, we're one nation, we're in competition. This is all just for the masses. The truth, there is no such thing. There's only planning. It's like a big, huge Marshall Plan. And at this point, there was some discussion of steel and particularly automobiles. I remember him saying that automobiles would be imported from Japan on an equal footing with our own domestically produced automobiles, but the Japanese product would be better. Things would be made so they would break and fall apart. That is in the United States. I mean, come on. I mean, who doesn't know that if you want a car to last, you buy a Toyota. And if you want your car to break apart quickly, you buy a Chrysler or a Dodge these days, because American made just isn't what it used to be, right? But it's not by accident. It's not because the know-how wasn't here. It's by design. The idea is you could get a little bit disgusted with your Ford, GM, or Chrysler product or whatever, because little things like window handles would fall off more and plastic parts would break, which had they been made of metal would hold up. Your patriotism about buying American would soon give way to practicality, that if you bought Japanese, German, or imported, that it would last longer and you would be better off. Patriotism would go down the drain then. The United States was seen as continuing to be sort of the keystone of this global system, but heavy industry would be transported out. I'll once again, I'll say this, that there was a time when American made signified quality, right? In industry, in appliances. And you can see that by those of you who still have a fridge from the 80s, you still have it. Nobody has a fridge from the 90s. Nobody still has a fridge from the 2000s. People maybe have their fridges now for 5, 6 years, 7 years if they're not using them heavily, and then they're built to break, just like other appliances and products. This is, in stark contrast still to sort of the Japanese traditions. Now, of course, we have China as basically producing everything. I mean, 95% of our goods, or 90% of our goods. You have, countries like India, Vietnam, Cambodia producing a little bit. But you can see how this plan is completely played out and how it has brought extreme dependence, right? And this was the idea. Just imagine, think about the quote unquote leaders, Congress, Senate, governors, presidents, who had to have seen at some point that a once more independent nation, and I'm saying more because the Fed had already been in place, because the taxation system had already been in place, because the US government being a corporation system had already been in place. So those things were already in place. But to see that with every year, my family, my community, my nation is becoming more and more dependent on others when we once weren't. Look at a nation like America. Why would you need to import anything? There isn't a need to import anything. You wouldn't need to import a single thing. Everything's here. Everything that we could possibly need. One of the comments made about heavy industry was that we had enough environmental damage from smokestacks and industrial waste, and some of the other people could put up with that for a while. This again was supposed to be a redeeming quality for Americans to accept. You took away our industry, but you saved our environment, so we really didn't lose on it, as if environment or that is a localized problem. But it also goes to show why on the international stage, countries like China were given a free pass on, I think their environmental standards are non-existent, or were non-existent until very recently in heavy industry. And while the world was talking about taxing the shit out of you and giving you restrictions on when you could heat your home and when you could use electricity and use your car and guilt you into eating fake vegan food, while all this was happening, it was 1935 in China, and they're just burning the shit out of everything. Of course, they're clearing out the rainforests in other places of the world. So it explains why in this global cult system, some places are giving a free pass while others are being completely restricted in certain areas, because it is not about really the environment or any of that. It's just about control. Shifting populations and economies, tearing the social roots. Think about it again, 1969. And along this line, there were talks about people losing their jobs as a result of industry and opportunities for retraining, and particularly population shifts would be brought about. They would be sort of people without roots in their new locations, and traditions are easier to change in a place where there are a lot of transplanted people, as compared to trying to change traditions in a place where people grew up and had an extended family where they had roots. Now, think about this, not just from an American standpoint, where cultural differences from east to west and now north to south are existent, but far less significant as think of Europe, where whole populations have been transferred from one nation to another, which is still okay, kind of, but then you have people from vastly different traditions, right? Muslim countries, people brought in the millions, literally, by default, whether that was intentional or not. We know it was, but destroying the native culture, right? And in turn, of course, through warfare, the West has destroyed some of their countries. So that it's not like this is a one-way street, but the notion that you offered incentives for people to move, whether that's one state over or from east to west in the United States, you give someone a better paying job in a big corporation, you have them on a rotating system where every 5-6 years to go into a new location, they never have roots, they don't have a community, the tradition is not kept up, and that's how you can alter and change culture very, very quickly. And nobody can do anything against it, because only tight knit communities do that. People that have roots, people that have their families have been there, they know each other. And that's why, people always see this as a bad thing, but that's why people complain often when they come into sort of one of the remaining old small towns where people have lived for generations and they have their ways of doing things, good or bad. It's not about that. But, newcomers are looked at a little suspiciously, and they're like, okay, are you here to assimilate or are you here to change us? Right. There are very few places left like that, but they still have that sense of, this is our place, our tradition, this is how we do things. There's very little left of that, right? And I'm not saying that being set in your ways is necessarily a good thing, but this is an unrestricted, limitless cultural rape that has happened all over the world. Also, in this vein, it was mentioned, and he used a plural personal pronoun we. We take control first of the port cities, New York, San Francisco, Seattle. The idea being that this is a piece of strategy. The idea being that if you can control the port cities with your philosophy and your way of life, the heartland in between has to yield. I can't elaborate more on that, but it's interesting. That's what Dr. Dunegan is saying. Again, this is all from his perspective as he attended this lecture. If you look around, the most liberal areas of the country, and progressively so, are the seacoast cities. The heartland, the Midwest, does seem to have maintained its conservatism, but as you take away industry and jobs and relocate people, then this is a strategy to break down conservatism. I will give you an example of this is, look at a state like Colorado. Colorado being a traditional, very conservative, red-blooded American state, because of transplants, because of people, moving in from California and other highly liberal places, the state has changed dramatically to a unbelievable degree. The same, is trying to happen in other northern states. It's trying to happen, Montana, Wyoming, people moving in. The same is trying to happen in states like our state in Tennessee, where at least the urban areas, Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, Memphis, wherever there's a large influx of people from more liberal states, that begins to swift, that culture begins to change very quickly. And this is all deliberate, right? As you can see, there's a long standing plan behind all of this. When you take away industry and people are unemployed and poor, they will accept whatever change seems to offer them survival, and their morals and their commitment to things will all give way to survival. Think about what Fauci said. He said it, that was played. It was a phone call that was recorded and that was played in a congressional hearing. And Fauci was, he was talking about the anti-vaxxers and his, how he worded it, and how these people, once they were under pressure from their employers, once they were under pressure from not being able to purchase things, to go to the store, to live their lives, all their ideological bullshit, as Fauci called it, would go out the window, and they would accept, the bioweapon, if you will. And so these are all things that are like we say, these are all tactics that are being deployed and used. It was hoped and expected that the worldwide specialization would be carried on, meaning that certain nations would carry out certain roles in the world. With this global interdependence, national identities would tend to be de-emphasized. Each area depended on every other area for one or another elements of its life. We would all become citizens of the world rather than citizens of any one country. And this is, of course, the rhetoric of the UN Agenda 2030, of the World Economic Forum, of everything that we've been hearing for the last years is exactly that. The world is growing together. Digitization is bringing everyone closer. We are citizens of the world, global citizens. We are stakeholders in a stakeholder economy. We depend on each other. And you think about the world now less and less. And if you think about financially, economically, geopolitically, you start thinking less and less of nations and more of areas that are specialized in certain things. Now, this is the food production area of the world. This is the industry of the world. This is the technological capital of the world. This is the financial. These are the financial cap. That's how this is developing, right? It's so, just think of it. Once again, this is from 1969. Sports as a tool of societal change or social change. Sports in the United States was to be changed in part as a way of de-emphasizing nationalism. Soccer, a worldwide sport, was to be emphasized and pushed into the United States. This was of interest because in this area, the game of soccer was virtually unknown at that time. Soccer is seen as an international sport and would be promoted, and then traditional sport of American baseball would be de-emphasized and possibly eliminated because it might be seen as too American, which is, you look at it, how billions and billions of dollars have been poured into soccer and soccer programs and youth programs and everywhere in America in the past 40 years or so, or even longer. But now it's, the nation is still nowhere near competitive in the game of soccer compared to most of the traditional soccer countries, but money is flowing almost in unlimited ways into this. And of course, the deconstruction of baseball is real. It's become much less of a mass sport than it used to be. It's still fairly popular, but nothing like in the heyday. And once again, we can see this from a 1969 perspective. I seem to recall, Dr. Dunegan is speaking here, he said football would be hard to dismantle because it was so widely played in colleges as well as in the professional leagues, and would be harder to tear down. There was something else also about the violence in football that met a psychological need that was perceived, and people have a need for this violence. Very important in sports, listen to this, was sports for girls. Athletics would be pushed for girls. This was intended to replace dolls. Baby dolls would still be around, a few of them, but you would not see the number and variety of dolls. Dolls would not be pushed because girls should not be thinking about babies and reproduction. Girls should be out on the athletic field just as the boys are. Girls and boys really don't need to be all that different. Tea sets were to go the way of dolls, and all these things that traditionally were thought of as feminine would be de-emphasized as girls got into more masculine pursuits. So all of this is to change the role model of what young girls should look like or look to be. While she's growing up, she should look to be an athlete rather than to look forward to being a mother. I'm going to have to take my glasses off for this one because I can't think of, another area that has been so successfully co-opted in such evil ways, right? Because all these other things, as evil and as planned as they were, they're not going as much to the core as motherhood is, right? As family, as the strongest mothers, as really the backbone of any society. Whether it's, I mean, I'm at a loss for words, honestly, how perfectly this is played out. And once we can see, which is so important, once we can see this journey that has only taken place in the last 50 years, which in the span of human thinking or human history is nothing. But what the changes that have happened in the last 50 plus years are far more than the changes that have happened in the 500 years before that, or more. It's incredible. And so, especially the part where girls and boys have to be alike, and this idea that we're the same, equal in rights, naturally equal in value, naturally equal in importance, all of that, yes, 100%, and that's true. But the same, no, we've never been the same. Men and women are not the same. They will never be the same. Not biologically, anyways. They will never be the same. And the striving for that is part of the inverted consciousness, part of the psychopathy of our time. It's the most beautiful thing in this construct, while we're inhabiting these avatars, that women are women and men are men. And that for 99 point something percent of the population is a biological, a psychological, and a physical truth. There's the odd exemption to every rule. Nothing wrong about that whatsoever. But all these changes, which probably you would have had a hard time even explaining the LGBTQ plus community in 1969 to the degree that it is now. I don't even think you could have explained it, even if it was, of course, part of the plan. The insanity to which this has come could not have been even remotely understood by the people then. It is still hard to understand for most people now. Sex and violence inculcated through entertainment. Another huge subject about so much, we could say so much about how this has happened, but here is what Dr. Day said in 1969 about this. Movies would gradually be made more explicit as regards sex and language. After all, sex and rough language are real, and why pretend that they are not? There would be pornographic movies in the theaters and on television. VCRs were not around at that time, and think about this. This is Dr. Dunegan recording these tapes in 1989. He said VCRs were not around at the time, but he had indicated that these cassettes would be available, and video cassette players would be available for use in the home, and pornographic movies would be available for use on these as well as in a neighborhood theater and on your television. He said something like, "You'll see people in the movies doing everything you can think of." He went on to say that all of this is intended to bring sex out in the open. Violence would be made more graphic. This was intended to desensitize people to violence. There might need to be a time when people would witness real violence and be part of it. Later on, it will become clear where this is headed. So there would be more realistic violence in entertainment, which would make it easier for people to adjust. People's attitudes toward death would change. People would not be so fearful of it, but more accepting of it. And they would not be so aghast at the sight of dead people or injured people. Now, of course, this includes today virtual reality, gaming, TV shows, Netflix, Amazon Prime, you name it. For me, as somebody who was away from entertainment in terms of movies, I'm actually a songwriter. I know the trends in the writing. I know the trends in music very well. I know how it's pushed. I know how it's all of that. I know. But I was for a long time really away, and we were away. We didn't own a TV. We were away from movies and that kind of entertainment. And what we were once we started including this in our work and our research, once we entered this sphere again, it was the era of Netflix, and Prime, Amazon Prime Video, and all that on-demand TV. I was shocked at what I was seeing is one, what was presented, the offerings were extremely violent. So, you would have the genre of horror movies, and then you would have sort of action movies, and there was a huge difference. To the degree of the visuals, there's rarely any difference any longer. The horror might be more focused on the fear and the panic factor, but in the visuals are just as graphic in both. um, it is also that there are almost no wholesome shows or movies out there that are not, pushing some sort of subtle societal changes. Everything has an agenda. 90% is violent. And then the other thing was too that it was getting, you will know why. It'll be explained here why. It is for me sort of increasingly difficult to find older movies, which I might have enjoyed more, or shows that were more wholesome, to even find them or get access to them. And you would think that for people who still want to see that, that would be easier to do, but it's not. And this explains it totally. Your mind will be blown on this one. People would just learn to say, well, I don't want that to happen to me. We're still talking about death and being used to death and all kinds of that. This was the first statement suggesting that the plan includes numerous human casualties, with the survivors which which the survivors would see, which we're now beginning, right, really to see this plan play out. Music will get worse. In 1969, rock music was getting more and more unpleasant. It was interesting, just his words, the way he expressed it. It would get worse, acknowledging that it was really bad. Lyrics would become more openly sexual. No new sugary romantic music would be publicized like that which had been written before that time. All of the old music would be brought back on certain radio stations and records for older people to hear, and older folks would have sort of their own radio stations to hear, and for younger people, their music, as it got worse and worse, would be on their stations. Older folks would just refuse to hear the junk that was offered to young people, and the young people would accept the junk because it identified them as their generation and helped them feel distinct from the older generation. He went on to say that the music would carry a message to the young, and nobody would even know the message was there. They would just think it was loud music. Um, Again, being a songwriter, an artist, I had a record deal, I was touring, I was doing all that. Um, I was very aware of what was happening to music, of how fast the changes were happening, how certain genres were completely co-opted. Hip hop, once a at least partially very poetic and beautiful genre, was turned into the most violent, sexist, racist, crap music that it is today. And what is, it is sort of the way that is pushed out to the young people is the messaging for girls, especially, for men, for boys to sort of portray the image of it is okay to be violent, it is okay to be sexually violent and racist and all of that, and for girls to be one thing and one thing only, right? To be used, to be that object. Unbelievable. And exactly like it said here, it's sort of packaged into a noise, into um, a a box of noise that to older generations is so foreign and sounds so horrible that they often don't even get to even hear the lyrics, which is exactly the point, because they then could potentially offer guidance to their grandkids or children and say, hey, are you actually listening to what this music is saying to you? It's, of course, exactly what's playing out. It won't change the older people. They're already set in their ways, but the changes would all be aimed at the young who are in their formative years, and the older generation would be passing. Not only could you not change them, but they were relatively unimportant anyhow. Once they live out their lives and are gone, to the younger generation being formed are the ones that would be important for the future and in the 21st century. Along with bringing back old music and movies for older people, there were other privileges that would also be accorded older folks: free transportation, breaks on purchases, discounts, tax discounts, a number of privileges just because they were older. This was stated to be sort of a reward for the generation which had grown up through the Depression and had survived the rigors of World War II. They had deserved it, and they were going to be rewarded with all these goodies. And the bringing back of the good old music and the good old movies was going to help ease them through their final years in comfort. Then the presentation began to get rather grim, because once that generation passed, and that would be in the late 80s and early 90s, most of that group would be gone, and then gradually things would tighten up, and the tightening up would be accelerated. The old movies and old songs would be withdrawn. The gentler entertainment would be withdrawn. This is exactly what I was talking about. Now, I want you just to imagine one thing, because here, and I'm gonna make it clear why. If you look at our world as sort of independent nations with their flags and their own governments and their own things and their own everything, and the people of most nations elect their leaders, and then those leaders make good or bad choices. If you look at it that way, you can never understand what was presented here and what we have talked about in other shows so often. You have to look at our world as a closed construct, and that is under the control and ownership, still to this day, under the control and ownership of a group of entities that is playing us in a social engineering game like characters, like video characters. As long as we don't override that programming is played out, and we are playing it out as actors in this script. Literally. People are not willing often to accept this as a reality, but it is the only way to change it. Unless we are willing to accept that this has been going on for eons. And this is what I wanted to say, why I said please stick around for the end of the show. This is like a repetitious cycle that has happened over and over and over again. Societies and civilizations are built up. It is always the same technocratic path. It always leads to, so far, the same inevitable outcome, where a reset happens. And I would suggest that our behaviors are accelerating, intensifying, or confirming that reset. What is my proof in this? What is my evidence? The only remnants that we find of older ways of life that are still alive come from indigenous people. Some indigenous people all over this construct still exist that live similarly to how their ancestors had lived thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. There is seemingly no technological civilization that survives through these cycles in any meaningful way. So we don't have linear progression forward. We have buildup of technological, technocratic civilizations. We have catastrophe, and we have a restart, not from scratch, but at a significant disadvantage. We're on this path again. And I think the owners and rulers of this construct, they're playing this game over and over again, sort of seeing if they can play it out at one time. I do believe that. The only thing that can change that is consciousness that begins to override the program, because it is a higher form of existence. It is the highest form of existence. These programs are lower forms of existence, right? And they're strong, they are enticing, they are made attractive, they're everywhere. It's very easy to fall into them, and most people do from birth. But when consciousness reaches a certain level, it can override that. When you become part of a free being, or you are become a free being again, and you actually choose to participate or not, choose to go along with these things or not, this is this critical stage that we're in. And unless we see the complexity of the system and the complexity and the foresight and the strategy of planning which these people had, I mean, compared to their planning foresight and compared to their strategy, think about it. The things that they presented here in 1969, we collectively as humans were complete infants. Most people couldn't even imagine that such a form of societal programming and social engineering could even exist, let alone that anyone could have the power to make that happen. So for me, the importance in presenting this information in its entirety, and I've revisited Dr. Day's presentation a couple of times over the years, so have others. But to bring it back at this particular moment in time was important, because I think many people feel certain things, but to be able to then intellectually connect the dots and confirm what they're feeling on another level helps make new decisions and shifts. This is what this is about, right? It all leads back to 18 words. All our work leads back to 18 words. I discussed this in my Sunday sermon yesterday on Locals. I call it jokingly the Sunday sermon, but these 18 words are the following. First, do what you can. First, become the best possible version of yourself. So that is the what. That is the imperative. Become the best possible version of yourself. Here is the how. Do what you can with what you have where you are. It is a strategy, and it is an excuse killer, because it removes all of the I can't do it because I don't have enough money. I can't do it because I don't have this. Do what you can with what you have where you are to become the best possible version of yourself. That is literally the 18 words around which all of this work is centered. And if we can all embody this, all of us together and individually and collectively, no such programs could ever come to full fruition, nor could they have any power over us. And once we know this, what can we do when we know things? Only when we know things can we withdraw energy from a thing and direct it somewhere else. Otherwise, we're by default participating without understanding it, without comprehending it. So this series will go on because we'll bring this to full fruition. There's other areas that Dr. Day discussed that you might not have thought about, or that we might not have discussed in depth. We'll do this in the following days. But I encourage you, if you want to go ahead, we put the links to the full audio tapes by Dr. Dunegan, who was in attendance that day in March 1969. There's a video with the entire audio tapes that you can watch. It's in the video description, or you can read the entire transcript. It's also in the video description. So yeah, please share this. Please share part 1 also, and part 2. I think a lot of people need to see this, see the bigger picture, and I think we can accomplish a lot. All right, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for being here with us. We love you. We appreciate you. And we will be back with you again very, very soon. You could be only a few clicks away from experiencing something amazing, something that has changed thousands of lives all over the world. I'm talking about a high consciousness field similar to those at pilgrimage sites and sacred places. It's where people go to heal, to connect, and to become the best possible version of themselves. With FLFE, you can bring such a high consciousness field into your home right now. It's a spiritual quantum technology based on the work of Nikola Tesla. better sleep, more energy, greater well-being, improved finances, electrosmog mitigation. These are only some of the things people on the FLFE service are experiencing. Try it now for 15 days completely free of charge, no credit card needed. Just click on a link down below to start your free, no strings attached FLFE trial right now.